to regulate this area of criminal law. Republican treason in the Republican era seems to have encompassed the following kinds of things. So here, before this period, here's what treason was: joining the enemy, rousing the enemy against the state, delivering a Roman citizen to the enemy, cowardice in command, the person is a commander, misappropriation of war booty, materials you collect in war, neglect of religious duties by a magistrate, putting Roman citizens to death without trial, and a criminal attack against the magistrate. This is a pretty big list of offenses, but yet it omits one category that was to become hugely important later, and that is defamation. You notice handing someone over to the enemy, fighting with the enemy against your state. This is treason. But what is not treason is insulting the ruler, defamation. And it appears that apart from one possibly dubious example, there is no record of such an accusation in the Republic. Before the Empire, in the Republic of Rome, no one ever raised as a matter of treason simple defamation. And this continues, this pattern, even under Augustus, until the time we're looking at. Then, in the year 2 BC, 2 years in the Western calendar, the Gregorian calendar, before the birth of Christ, there is a change. Augustus's daughter, Julia, and those who had committed adultery with her are prosecuted with the label of violating sovereignty. That's what Tacitus tells us. Julia was tried by her father, Augustus, the emperor, who assumed authority to judge this offense. Now, in another case, 4 years later, 6 years later, in 6 AD, there was some anonymous pamphlet. Somebody wrote an anonymous pamphlet against the emperor, and it seems relatively clear that this is the moment when abusive language began to be shifted by Augustus in the direction of being conceived as potentially treasonous behavior. And there were a whole lot of cases that followed this one. So let's be clear. Such trials depend on the idea that a verbal attack, not a physical attack, a verbal attack on Augustus, the emperor, is equivalent to treason against the state. And this sensibility will have evolved over time because earlier in Augustus's reign, it wasn't so. As Peachin puts it, and I quote him again, first and foremost, there is the question as to why any offense perpetrated against Augustus could or would be interpreted as treason, and then the question of where jurisdiction for such an offense might lie, who would judge it. Well, for all the ambiguities that there exist in individual cases, Peachin detects a crucial moment around 7 or 6 BC. He calls it a significant, in fact, what looks to have been an absolute transformation. We found the year now, the precise year. Something seems to have happened in the year 6 BC that changed everything and made defamation now a crime of treason. And what that affair was has to do with the so-called Second Cyrene Edict, the second edict involving Cyrene, first published in 1927, and which dates to just that time. Now, the story behind this decree is complicated, and I'll just summarize the events as best we know it. There were 3 Romans in the province of Cyrene, of course modern Libya roughly, who were engaged in some altercation, a quarrel, with local Greeks. 3 Romans quarreling with Greeks, and they trumped up, that is the Romans, trumped up a charge against the Greeks that involved some kind of danger to the emperor. The Romans were accusing the Greeks, who inhabited, of course, at that time, Egypt and ruling Egypt and Cyrene. The Romans accused the Greeks of something something that endangered the emperor. They were sent to Rome so the complaints could be heard. But Augustus saw through the Romans' pretensions and dismissed them. In other words, the Romans had fabricated a charge against the Greeks. Even though they were Roman, Augustus the emperor realized that they were dishonest, and he dismissed them and sent the Romans away. In the meantime, however, ambassadors from the Greek community in Cyrene, who came to Rome either at the same time or maybe a little later, said that one of the Romans, this is the countercharge, the Greeks are they're getting their way back. One of the Romans had removed statues which had been erected by the community from public spaces in Cyrene. And on one of these statues, the city had inscribed the name of Augustus. So the Romans said, these Greeks have endangered the emperor, and the emperor doesn't believe it. The Greeks come, and what do they say? They say that one of those Romans moved a statue that had the name of the emperor on it. Notice the charge. That's all they say they did. Now, scholars have tried to find out more about it, but this much at least is clear. So the charge against the Greeks, against the Romans here, involves a statue. Now, no doubt it was illegal to move statues from public spaces without authorization, but why should this have engaged the attention of the emperor? It is difficult, Pietschens concludes, not to suppose that Augustus chose to investigate it because there was an insinuation, or maybe even a specifically voiced charge, of an infraction against Augustus' majesty. This is the kind of charge that later on became very common under later emperors, but the procedure seems to have gotten rolling with exactly this case, not planned in advance, but the consequence of a set of events that changed the way defamation of the emperor would be viewed from now on. Here we have the case. Pietschens says, why did Augustus listen to this charge about moving the statue? Why did he take it so seriously? Why did he take it more seriously than the Romans' charge, never mind a statue, that there was an actual danger to the emperor's life? No, he focused on the moving of the statue. Why did he do that? Now, in Pietschens' very learned and very careful analysis of this edict, the second Cyrene edict, there is one aspect that he did not discuss. And this is that the first charge concerning mistreatment of a statue of the emperor was, as far as we can see, leveled by a Greek. The first person ever to say you shouldn't move a statue of the emperor was a Greek. And what's more, not just any Greek, but Greeks living in Cyrene, a Greek city near the Mediterranean coast in Cyrenaica, which had been under Egyptian rule for over 200 years. Frequently, it was a brother of the ruling Ptolemy in Egypt who was also the king in Cyrenaica. Cyrenaica, this particular area, was ceded to Rome in 96 BC, and in the year 74, it became a province of the Roman state. 44 years before this happened to Egypt itself. Egypt became, in the year 31, a province of the Roman Empire. Now, Greeks living in Cyrenaica would have been accustomed to regarding their king as a pharaoh, since the Ptolemies had, as we have seen, assumed the divine prerogatives of their Egyptian predecessors. So the ruling king and queen in Egypt and in Cyrenaica were regarded as deities and received cult. Once Rome absorbed Egypt, Augustus followed in their path. As Diana Kleiner observes in a nice book called Cleopatra and Rome, she says, Octavian became the master of Egypt even before he became Augustus, that is, before he assumed the new title, and he inherited the traditional rites of the pharaohs and their Ptolemaic successors. One of these rites was to celebrate official cults and be depicted as doing so on the walls of Egypt's temples. So we have on the walls of temples representations of Augustus, the Roman emperor, acting as though he were Pharaoh and therefore as a divine king. And Kleiner says that what motivated Augustus to allow himself to be depicted with the posture, clothing, and headdress of the Egyptian king was his wish to be viewed in Egypt as the natural successor to the pharaohs and the Ptolemies and their most recent queen, Cleopatra. And yet this was not the practice of Augustus in other parts of the emperor. Rather, as Kleiner says, Egypt had a special status, a unique position that distinguished it from all the other territories in the Augustan age, since it was the special province of Augustus belonging to him and not under senatorial jurisdiction. Egypt was the emperor's personal province. It was not a province of the state and the senate. So Egypt is very special. And here's Augustus representing himself as the divine successor to the pharaohs and the Ptolemies, who themselves, as we have seen, assumed those rights. Now, the second Cyrene edict that we've been talking about doesn't give any specific details about the statues that were moved or why Greeks living in Cyrene would have imagined that Augustus would regard this as a serious breach of respect. But it's reasonable to think that these Greeks were transferring expectations concerning the treatment of images of their local kings back in the days of the Ptolemies to their Roman ruler, and they had good reason to imagine that Augustus would take such a charge in the same spirit. What I'm saying here is no one had ever accused anyone of treason because they moved a statue. But here are Greeks bringing this charge against Romans and before the Roman emperor, and the Roman emperor is listening. Where did they get the idea that he would listen? Well, they got the idea because that's what they were used to. They were used to divine kings, and any offense against the image, the cult statue of a king, was, of course, potential treasonous. The Romans would have been surprised at such a charge. They wouldn't have expected Augustus to think of this as being treasonable, because there was no charge against the safety or danger of the Roman emperor. That's what the Romans had charged the Greeks with, danger to the Roman emperor. This is just moving the statue. They wouldn't have expected it. Something new was happening. That Augustus followed up this episode with further actions of the same sort shows that he recognized that his judgment in this case as a new precedent and was now eager to confirm it. So we have here another example, it seems, of how a foreign artistic tradition, statues, involving representations of the Ptolemies, contributed almost by accident to a new conception of the person of the Roman emperor. From now on, defamation of the emperor, moving a statue, affecting his image in any way, was equal to treason, and the cases would be judged by the emperor himself. There have been a great many studies of the imperial cult and the way in which it was given expression in the Roman provinces and Rome. In that book I mentioned a little earlier, John Ma observes, and now it's very small, I'm coming right to the end here, so we're almost just another 2 or 3 minutes before I finish, but I want a very small detail. This is, we have it in Greek had cases like Arabic. Arabic has the nominative, which we call the genitive, and the accusative. Greek also has a dative case, which means to somebody. And when the Greeks would have an inscription, it pointed out that you used the dative to someone, always for a god. You didn't use them for a human being. So if I wrote, this is a statue dedicated to Jupiter, to Zeus, to this other god, I would put the name of the god in that case, suggesting that I'm giving the statue to him. It's not a statue of him, it's a dedication of the statue to him. And I've been wondering, could that statue of Augustus that was moved have had an inscription that said to Augustus and therefore represented him as a god? To conclude, The transformation of the emperor's identity was gradual. When he first assumed complete power in the state, Augustus was careful to distance himself from claims to divinity in Rome. When he first became emperor, he was very careful not to present himself as a god. Gilles Sauron, a French scholar, in a very detailed investigation of the way ideologies operated through art in Rome, has said that Augustus' apparent modesty in this respect, not to call himself a god, was a departure from the precedent of his adopted father, Julius Caesar. Because we learn from an ancient writer, a commentator on Virgil, that there was a statue of Julius Caesar on the Capitoline Hill, with a golden star crowning his head, and it had an inscription on the base that read, "To Caesar the demigod." And interestingly, that's in the dative. To Caesar the demigod. In other words, it wasn't just a statue of him, it was a statue dedicated to him as a demigod. Now, Augustus, by contrast, refused to have a statue of himself placed inside the Pantheon. That's the temple that still exists in Rome today, that round Pantheon, the temple of all the gods, as his general Agrippa had intended when he first dedicated it in 25 BC. In fact, he didn't even want to call it the Pantheon, he wanted to call it the Augusteum, in honor of Augustus, a temple to Augustus as God. And yet, he didn't want his statue in the temple, and this, according to this scholar Sauron, was, I quote him, a rupture with the inheritance of his father Caesar. He was content, Augustus was, in this period, to represent himself just as God's representative on earth, and not as a god himself. 2 decades later, the time of the Cyrenian inscription, another statue located in Cyrene and reflecting practices of worship long established in Alexandria may have pushed Augustus' sense of his divinity in a new direction. 20 years later, he's not so modest, he's beginning to think that any offense against him is an offense against the state, is treasonous, because he is a figure now of becoming semi-divine importance. To conclude, the poet Horace wrote, "Captured Greece when it was captured her rude conqueror." This reference was to the dominance of Greek culture in the Rome of his time. But he might as well have reflected that conquered Egypt also had subdued, in a different way, the Roman people, teaching them to revere as divine their rulers at the dawn of the Roman Empire. Thank you. I am done.
Thank you, Professor Konstan, for this very rich presentation.